I'm going to make a hypothesis in the Idaho 4 case that I want to lay out for the first time in full to a lot of people. And in the scientific community, a hypothesis is not something that you take personally. You make a hypothesis, you say, what if this is the case? That is a hypothesis. Then you test the hypothesis. If it turns out your hypothesis is wrong, there's nothing personal about it. It's part of the scientific method. You make a hypothesis, then you test the facts to see if the hypothesis holds true. Let's make a hypothesis on the theory on Idaho 4. Don't take it personally. It's just a hypothesis. The devil is in the details. Let's go. Now, all along, I have said from the very beginning of this case, what if Bryan Cobberger was just the getaway driver? And I've made lots of comments and connections to Brent Kopacka and why I thought he was more likely the person that went into the house. Bryan Cobberger may not have ever gone into the house. That was part of my hypothesis. And for years, it seems like, well, at least a year on YouTube, I've been testing that hypothesis in large part. And I've delved down several areas, but I keep coming back to the idea of what if Bryan Cobberger never went into the house? Now, here's the thing. We have a million unanswered questions in this case, including why did it take so many hours to call 911? What happened in that case? Why did one of the parents of the survivors say, you need to finally call 911? That was hidden from a lot of people. There was back and forth phone calls, one of the survivors and their parent, and eventually they were said, look, you got to call 911 at some point. You can't just keep delaying this kind of thing. What was going on in the house during those 9 hours? I have a hypothesis today that I want to share with you that ties everything I've said in this case into a neat little bow for something to consider. And again, in a scientific method, one doesn't take the hypothesis personally if it turns out the hypothesis is wrong. The idea is you make a hypothesis and you say, what if it happened like this? And then if it's wrong, it's wrong. It's not a big deal. So let me lay it down for you as best I can. In my scenario, we're going to focus on the idea that Bryan Cobberger took Brent Kopacka to the house and that Brent Kopacka and possibly others went into the house and committed the murders at Idaho 4. And I realize that a lot of you can't stand this line of inquiry, so shut the shit off right now if you can't stand the line of inquiry. It's a hypothesis. Prove me wrong. Let me show you what I think answers a whole lot of questions. Now, realize in this hypothesis, we're setting aside for the moment why the hit happened. I have reasons on why the hit happened, and I'll try to be brief about it at first, but that's not the important part of the hypothesis. The important part of the hypothesis today is explaining the missing time on the 911 call and what happened with Bryan Cobberger pleading guilty. My hypothesis explains all of that in a neat nutshell, but I want to lay some things out. So let's say, for example, that someone was going to be killed in that house. Now, I have a hypothesis. One of the hypotheses is not the big hypothesis. The big hypothesis is about the knife sheath, the planted evidence. That's the big hypothesis and the gap of the 9-hour time before they called 911. That's what I'm going to explain in this hypothesis. But there's another hypothesis that we're going to have for a second. I believe there's a possibility that Kaylee was one of the targets, if not the primary target. Let's set aside why Kaylee is one of the targets, but I believe that there's a possibility that Dylan Mortensen, for example, in this hypothesis, it is not fact, it is not proof, and I know that many of you say, we know what happened because Bryan Cobberger pled guilty. There's a scenario in this hypothesis of why somebody would plead guilty to something that they didn't do. They had to. They had no choice in this case. This was a rigged trial and never was going to be a fair trial, and they needed, they being the prosecution, Idaho, the university, everyone needed to have a scapegoat, somebody that would go down for it. They could not let this be an unsolved crime. And so Bryan Cobberger is paying the ultimate price. That is part of the hypothesis, that guilty plea may not have been because he did everything that they said, maybe part of what they said. All right, so in this scenario, Dylan Mortensen lures Kaylee back to the house to make sure that she's there because she's an intended target of that weekend. There was a plan to hit that house, and Kaylee was going to be one of the targets, if not maybe the primary target. In this hypothesis, another part that we're going to set aside for the moment is that Brent Kopacka might have been employed along with somebody else to actually do the hit, that he had the skills to do what was happening. In this hypothesis that I've been saying, Bryan Cobberger and Brent Kopacka knew each other from Pennsylvania. I laid down many arguments on why they knew each other from Pennsylvania. Brent Kopacka may or may not even had a car. There's a scenario, and it seems to fit the logic of the timing of the routes of Bryan Cobberger leaving that night, that Bryan Cobberger literally was tipped off that now is the time. We're going to do something. And it's in my hypothesis, it's not even possible or necessary. It's not even necessary for Bryan Cobberger to know exactly what's going to happen. All he knows is he's asked to come pick up a friend, Brent Kopacka, and take him to an address. Now, one of the things I pointed out to you many, many times is that Molly McMichael said that when she was trying to deliver food to the house at 1122 King Road residence, her app took her in a circuitous route. It didn't take her to the front door of 1122 King Road residence. She had to drive around and around in circles trying to find the front of the house. Pay attention. One of the things I said to you as well is that if Brian Cobberger also was using the same kind of GPS coordinates to get to the front of the house at 1122 King Road residence, where he's taking somebody else, let's say Brian Cobberger is delivering somebody to the house because something's going to happen. And maybe Brian Cobberger does or doesn't know what's going to happen, but he's simply a driver. He's bringing somebody to the house. If he's using GPS coordinates, and I know you say, well, Brian Cobberger turned off his phone, doesn't mean he doesn't have another phone, because maybe he was smart enough, if he was involved in this, to turn his own phone off, but use a burner phone to do the location. The location, if Molly McMichaels is correct on GPS, would have taken him in a circuitous route around and around that house, trying to find the front of the house. Ultimately, the GPS, according to Molly McMichaels, took her to the back side of the house where the sloped area was going down to the back door. That is also where people say in the official narrative against Brian Cobberger parked. It was at the back of the house. Could it be because both of them were just simply using a typed in address, 1122 King Road residence, and the GPS was locating them and they were having problems finding the house, hence the reason for all the circling of the house, and hence also the parking at the back of the house where Molly said she parked and where they say that Brian Cobberger parked. And if that's the case, it tells you several things. Brian Cobberger didn't know that house. He wasn't familiar with the house. He was given a location. He was given an address, and GPS was taking him to the address. Molly McMichaels wanted to say, I was sitting right next to Cobberger. We both parked at the back side of the house. That, I believe, is a lie. Molly did not see him there. But it does tell us something interesting. Both of them were using GPS to find the location of 1122 King Road residence, and it took them to the back side of the house, where Brian Cobberger was also allegedly taken to the back side of the house. All right, so follow the logic. At this point, Brian Cobberger may just be delivering somebody. It's possible that he went and picked up a Brent Kopacka, who he knew from Pennsylvania, and Brent's like, hey, I need to go to this house. Can you take me there and drop me off? I'll just be a few minutes. In this scenario, it is possible Brian Cobberger didn't even know what was about to happen in the house. He was taking a friend and dropping him off and then waiting for his friend to return. It is possible in my scenario that sometime during that event, Brian Cobberger realized something was going horribly wrong. Maybe he heard screams. Maybe he saw something. Whatever the case may be, he peels out at a high rate of speed. I would say, in my hypothesis, the killer who he delivered to the house, maybe intentionally, maybe Brian Cobberger did bring a killer to the house knowing what was going to happen. Or maybe he brought them unwittingly and sped off when he panicked and realized, oh my God, I hear screams from inside the house. Something horrible is happening. I got to get the fuck out of here. And he peeled off. That is why also Brian Cobberger would say when he was picked up and arrested, has anybody else been arrested for this crime? Because he wasn't actually there. I mean, he was there, but he wasn't inside the house. And he knows that he dropped off somebody. So he's curious. Did you get the guy who actually did it? Oh shit, I'm the guy you think did it because my car was there. He maintains his silence, but he also maintains his factual innocence. Why factual innocence? Because Brian Cobberger knows he didn't go into the house. He couldn't have done it, but he's thinking, you guys are going to have to figure this out. You're going to figure it out. Maybe you put me there as a driver, but I wasn't in the house, so I'm maintaining my factual innocence. I wasn't in the house, and I know I wasn't in the house, and I can't wait to be exonerated. Problem is, in this scenario, Brent Kopacka, if he was one of the killers, went in there and got killed himself on December 14th, it was 1 month and 1 day after the murders. He was shot and killed in Pullman, Washington. It was known by several people, and I've laid out the evidence that law enforcement may believe that Brent Kopacka was involved in the crime. I have pointed out just recently in a video how on December 5th, weeks before Moscow Police Department said that they even knew who Brian Cobberger was, there's a document that lists 2 suspects and all the victims who were murdered. 2 suspects. One name is completely redacted. You don't know who it is. And on one of the many, many pages that shows multiple suspects, one name is unhighlighted. That is Brian Cobberger on the 5th of December, which means that Moscow PD lied on the stand saying that they'd never heard of Brian Cobberger until the 19th of December when they got the DNA hit saying he was in the house. That is not true. I gave a huge argument of why that DNA was planted, because what happened, in my opinion, is law enforcement knew early on, probably the FBI, not Moscow Police Department, but the law enforcement knew early on that that two people went to the house that night at least. It could have been a car with Brian Cobberger dropping off one of the killers that went into the house. That killer could have been Brent Kopacka. That's the two suspects' names that are blacked out on a bunch of the paperwork, one of which they fucked up when they left Brian Cobberger's name unredacted, showing Brian Cobberger was one of the suspects as early as December 5th. They knew he was there. That's the hypothesis. Did the officers know Brian Cobberger was there, and they even knew who the other person in the car was with Brian Cobberger? Brian Cobberger, however, in my hypothesis, didn't go into the house. Somebody else went into the house and they did the actual killings. Now, I don't believe that killer in my hypothesis. I don't believe that killer got back in Brian's car, because the DNA transfer would have been ridiculous. I don't care if you did strip out of your car naked. You're bringing some blood from that crime scene back into Brian Cobberger's car. Brian Cobberger's car was spotless. And no, it wasn't just because he had a month to clean it and all that shit. I don't even want to get into the stupidity of that. There's no way, in my opinion, the killer who was drenched in blood and would have been drenched in blood got back in Brian Cobberger's car. So my hypothesis on this is that Brian Cobberger delivered somebody to the house, found out that killings were going on and panicked and took off when he heard the screams and left the scene. That would be one scenario. And it would also explain why Brian Cobberger was there, and they knew he was there. Maybe they knew that who he delivered. That the problem was the killer himself later was shot and killed. And now they can't put the killer on trial because the killer's dead. They shot and killed Kopacka if he was the killer. And I've said that many, many times. I think that's the case. I think Othram Labs developed a DNA profile to Brent Kopacka, 4 brothers in Pennsylvania. I explained in a previous video why exactly I think that's Brent Kopacka. But here was the problem. They know Cobberger drove Kopacka to the scene in this hypothesis. This is a hypothesis only. They knew Cobberger drove Kopacka to the scene and that Kopacka went in and did the killings. Problem is that they ended up shooting and killing Kopacka, and now they can't put Kopacka on the scene. They're left with only other person that they know, which is Brian Cobberger, who did the driving, who probably didn't go into the house. And so they're like, okay, we're going to go after Cobberger as the person who committed this crime. We don't want to admit we fucked up and we killed Kopacka. There's reasons for that discovery, that hiding of the fact. So in the logic, it is, in my logic, I said, I now know why Ann Taylor thought that there was planted evidence on Brian Cobberger. They had reason to believe on the 5th of December, this was shortly after the murders, right? A couple weeks after the murders. They had reason to believe that Cobberger was the driver who was there. And maybe they even thought he went into the house, but they couldn't prove it. They didn't have DNA and they didn't have any eyewitnesses. Nobody could put him in there. They tried to lead Dylan Mortensen to identifying Cobberger. Was it possible he had bushy eyebrows? Is it possible he had a balaclava on? Is it possible this? You can see it in the documents if you're paying attention. The officers are leading Dylan. Dylan's first statement about what she saw that night had nothing to do with eyebrows. Officers led her to the eyebrows. Why? Because I believe officers already believed Brian Cobberger was there. They desperately need to place Brian Cobberger in the house because they need somebody to frame for the murder, because they done fucked up and they killed Brent Kopacka, who was the actual killer or one of the actual killers in the house. Brian Cobberger may or may not go into the house. And I'm not even sure if they knew that Brian Cobberger went into the house. They just need to place him there. So they're leading Dylan through the investigation. Did you see maybe bushy eyebrows? Oh, you did. You can see them leading her, in my opinion. That's my hypothesis. They believe that Cobberger was there. They're not sure if he went into the house, but they desperately need him in the house. They can't do it. Othram Labs get a DNA sample, they said, off of a knife sheath. Now here's the $1 million extra hypothesis I've never laid out before on the knife sheath and the missing delay of time of the 911 call. In my hypothesis, Dylan Mortensen knew something was going to happen. She lured Kaylee back to the house and she knew something was going to happen. Follow the logic here. First of all, I don't know that I believe that Bethany knew what was going to happen. My personal belief is I'm not sure Bethany knew what was going to happen. I do believe Dylan knew what was going to happen, at least in large part knew what was going to happen, and that she actually helped bring Kaylee back to the house so that Kaylee would be there. Kaylee had not been staying there for weeks. So I believe that that's something you can't overlook. And so in my hypothesis, Dylan knew something was going down. Dylan knew that the hit was coming on the house and something horrible was going to happen. I'm not sure Bethany knew that. I think Bethany is scared shitless and is keeping her mouth shut because she doesn't want the people who pulled this off to come after her next because something happened. So Dylan does know, in my hypothesis. Bethany doesn't. Well, Bethany knows now, I think, what happened, but she didn't, I think, necessarily know from the beginning what was going to happen that night. I think she might have been unwittingly wrapped up into it, and she had exculpatory evidence, meaning I think Bethany Funk saw something in the house that night that would exonerate Brian Cobberger. She saw somebody else in the house that night, but the problem is the feds, the law enforcement, they can't have that because she might have seen, follow the hypothesis, she might have saw Brent Kopacka in the house. And they can't have that because Brent Kopacka is dead and they don't want to admit they fucked up and they killed Brent Kopacka. They don't want to explain that whole thing. So all they're left with is the one other guy that they know was there or they believe was there, which was Brian Cobberger, who delivered Kopacka to the house. So they don't want Bethany Funk on the stand saying she saw Kopacka, because if she said she saw a bald guy, they're fucked. If she says if she gives them any kind of description of Kopacka and not Cobberger with the bushy eyebrows, they're fucked. So the best thing you can do is keep Bethany Funk from hitting the stand. She will never come testify because what she saw in the house would not lead to Cobberger. And she's just keeping her mouth shut. She doesn't want to have to testify about what she saw. Dylan is the one who's left telling the whole story, and they're leading her to the bushy eyebrows and all this stuff like that. Now, interject the knife sheath. Why the delay of the 911 call? Let's say the killers go in there and they commit the murders and they leave. They get back at their place afterwards thinking they got a successful hit, right? We did it. We got in, we got out. Fuck, where's the knife sheath? I don't have a knife sheath. Where the fuck's my knife sheath? Holy shit, we got a mistake. Maybe conversations even take place over social media with Dylan. We need the fucking knife sheath. Like, I think we left something in the house. So delay. They're trying to look for the knife sheath. The problem is, in my hypothesis, is that the knife sheath is underneath the body of Maddie Mogen. And that's a problem because, again, in this scenario, even if Dylan knew what happened, it must be traumatic for somebody to see a murdered person, somebody who's been mutilated horribly. So let's assume for a moment Maddie Mogen is mutilated. Kaylee is mutilated. Dylan's probably not going to want to go walk through the crime scene, traipsing through blood, looking for the missing knife. She's going to be looking other places, in the hallway, in the bathroom. Did something get dropped? Where's the fucking knife sheath? Looking for the knife sheath and other things. Cleanup. It was said in the court documents that there was evidence of a cleanup at that scene. That came out of the documents. Ann Taylor said, and she had an expert come on, an expert in forensics who wrote like 20 books on forensics, who said there's evidence of a cleanup at the scene. That went overlooked by a lot of people in America. An expert who had written like 20 books on forensics said there is evidence of a cleanup. There's also evidence, that same forensics person said, of multiple perpetrators. There was more than one person in the house, and maybe somebody was killing on 2 floors at the same exact time. There may have been 2 perpetrators in the house, 2 in the house, that were killing on floor 3 and floor 2 at the same exact time. It's not even necessary to believe that it was done with one weapon. It could have been multiple weapons. That was another thing that the forensic scientist was going to basically say, is that it could have been multiple weapons, multiple perpetrators, and evidence of a cleanup of the scene. So time's going by. They're missing the knife sheath and they're scared shitless. We almost had a perfect crime. We got in and we got out, but we're fucking missing the knife sheath. Now interjects the story. Brian Cobberger supposedly went back to celebrate, gloat, drive by his own crime scene at 9 o'clock the next morning after the murders, right? So the murders happened somewhere around 4 o'clock in the morning, 4:20 in the morning. Brian Cobberger goes back at, earlier that morning, and then down to Lewiston, Idaho. Now, let me interject a new hypothesis. What if what if Dylan, for example, in the house, knows that the hit happens, she can't find the knife sheath, everybody's delaying the 911 call because they can't find the fucking sheath. They're terrified DNA just got left at the house of the killers and it's going to put somebody away for this, and they want a clean sweep. They want to get away with this, right? And Dylan knows, like, maybe in this hypothesis, the killer has reached out and said, fuck, where's the goddamn knife sheath? Can you find the knife sheath? So there's a delay. They're looking for the knife sheath. But maybe Dylan is like a little bit fucking terrified to go traipsing through bloody rooms looking for the knife sheath. She's not going to certainly move Maddie's body to look for the knife sheath that's underneath Maddie's body. So she says, I can't find the knife sheath. Maybe then they employ Brian Cobberger, a forensics specialist who's going to school for criminology, to go back to the crime scene, suit up, go in, do whatever you have to do, find that fucking knife sheath. Whether or not Brian Cobberger went back to the house or not, I seriously doubt that he did go back. I doubt this because we've got a million nighttime photos of Brian Cobberger's house, a car around the house, a million of those. What we don't have is a clear, definitive picture of Brian Cobberger in his car on bright daylight camera, like it would have been if he had gone back at 9 in the morning. So I really doubt Brian Cobberger went back. But in this scenario, it's even possible. Brian Cobberger delivered somebody and was told, fuck, we lost the knife sheath. Help us find the knife sheath. And maybe he went back as a cleaner. That's a possibility. Did Brian Cobberger, specializing in forensics cleanups, did he go back to clean up or to help clean up and find the knife sheath? But again, maybe they didn't find it because the fucking knife sheath is underneath the body of Maddie Mogen. And so nobody wants to move the body. They're looking around on the floor. They're looking at whatever they can without disturbing the crime scene too much, because they got to be able to preserve the crime scene as much as possible. But they're looking for the goddamn knife sheath, but it's missing because it's underneath the body of Maddie Mogen. Eventually, what happens is, also we know from court documents that Dylan and Bethany, they're contacting other people. A massive amount of time goes by. The front door is wide open in the house. Allegedly, they're making phone calls. Eventually, in the court documents, you see someone basically twists one of the survivor's arms and says, "You got to call 911. You have to at this point. It's been too long." They're screwed. They know that something happened in the house. Dylan, in this hypothesis, knows that this was a lured in hit. So she knows that the people who did it, in part at least, because she was part of that. She doesn't want to have to explain that. But she can't call 911 yet because they can't find the fucking knife sheath. They've been looking for it forever. And it's because it's underneath the body of Maddie Mogen. And so finally, they have to call in 911. And now they're screwed because they don't realize, now we got to try and explain why the fuck we've taken so long to call 911. So a million stories come in about being terrified and not realizing and just calling people in the house and all kinds of shit that doesn't make sense to any of us, when the real answer is that they've been searching for the goddamn knife sheath that's been missing. That's the hypothesis. Now, when I say planted evidence, in this scenario, there's a couple problems with the knife sheath hypothesis. So let me walk you through those. The knife sheath hypothesis tends to fall down is, how could they plant evidence on Bryan Kohberger with the knife sheath? How could you say that an officer planted that knife sheath? Because there is arguments that the knife sheath wasn't found until the second pass of the house. Follow this again. The first pass of the house, they did not see the knife sheath. It was only until Detective Payne, I think, came on scene that he found the knife sheath. And so some have suspected, well, Payne brought the knife sheath to the crime scene and dropped it off. That's fine and dandy, except for, did they know already to finger Bryan Kohberger for the crime that early? That's a good question. It's possible in this hypothesis. But the other more likely scenario is this. They knew about Bryan Kohberger's name by the 5th of December, still well after the murders. So you can't say that the knife sheath was planted right away necessarily. But what they can say is that the DNA evidence linking Bryan Kohberger to the scene was planted. And that's, I think, what Ann Taylor was going to say. The knife sheath was always there. The knife sheath was hard to find because it was under the body of Maddie Mogen. And that's what the problem was, is that the delay was trying to find the fucking missing knife sheath, which was under Maddie. Eventually, when they called 911 and the bodies were moved, they ended up seeing, or somebody disturbed the scene, Payne, whatever he did. I don't know if he had to move Maddie's body, but when he found the knife sheath, that was it. The problem in this scenario is, guess what? The knife sheath didn't have DNA of anybody that they can finger for the crime on it. It didn't have Bryan Kohberger. And so Ann Taylor's argument is, you knew who Bryan Kohberger was well before you identified him with DNA. So how do we know that you didn't say, I already know Bryan Kohberger was at the scene? We don't have anything linking him to it. We tried to get Dylan to say she saw him. The best we can get is a bushy eyebrow story. We've leaned on, well, that was a later development. But the point being is that the idea is that they knew in their heart that Bryan Kohberger was there, that he delivered Brent Kopacka, and they knew all those things. Problem is, they killed Brent Kopacka and now they're fucked. They got to place somebody at the house. Problem is that it was too pristine of a crime scene, and they had nothing on Bryan Kohberger, but they knew he was there. So they had to make sure they put him there. One way they attempted to do that was they had Hawthorne Labs develop a profile, and they're thinking, there's no way Bryan Kohberger's DNA is not somewhere on there. And even listen to this. In this hypothesis, if Bryan Kohberger did deliver the killers to the house, or a killer like Brent Kopacka in the house, remember, the amount of DNA of Bryan Kohberger on the knife sheath, it was invisible to the human eye. It's the size, smaller than the size of a grain of sand. It was invisible. It was pico something, nano picos or some shit, some small ass fucking number. I'm not a scientist. It was very, very small, less than a grain of sand. That's the amount of DNA of Bryan Kohberger's at the entire crime scene. So if Bryan Kohberger did deliver somebody to the crime scene, and if that person went in with the knife sheath but then lost the knife sheath, it is possible just from skin cells. Listen, just from skin cells blowing around inside of his car, if he delivered the killer to the scene and the knife was in the car with Bryan Kohberger, his skin cell literally could float through the air and land on the knife sheath and put Bryan Kohberger's DNA in the house. Now, part of you says, then who cares? If Bryan Kohberger was there and he delivered somebody, he's a fucking killer. No, listen. In this scenario, in this particular hypothesis, Brian Koberger didn't even need to go into the house. He simply delivered somebody there. And there's a scenario, if you haven't been paying attention, in which Brian Koberger literally didn't even know what was going to happen. There's a scenario in which Brian Koberger literally took somebody to a house not having a clue, and maybe he was sitting outside the house and heard screams, saw something in the window as he's looking in the back window, the lights were on in the house maybe, right? There's a million scenarios in which Brian Koberger simply panicked when he realized, oh my God, there's people getting killed inside that house, and he peeled out and took off. Brian Cobberger likely, in this hypothesis, left without the killer. Because again, I have a hard time believing a killer drenched in blood is getting back in Cobberger's car and not leaving DNA. I certainly don't think Brian Cobberger got out of his car, went into a house, killed 4 people on 2 floors, and got back into his car in 8 minutes and didn't leave a trace of blood anywhere, including no blood coming and going from the house. That is an impossibility. I will stick to that to my dying day. That didn't happen that way. I've told you that a million times, and that's my gut feeling. It didn't happen that way. Brian Cobberger didn't go in there alone and come back out and trace no blood from the house to his car or inside of his car and somehow was so pristine because he's so smart. Yet he's not smart enough to leave his car behind when he goes to the crime scene or leave his phone behind when he goes to the crime scene. It makes no sense to me. Maybe you've got it all logicked out, but you think he's such a great criminologist that he didn't leave a single trace of DNA except for a little tiny grain of sand of his skin cell inside the house. And that's because he's so smart. But he's not smart enough to not take his own car to the crime scene or leave his cell phone behind. None of it makes sense other than the hypothesis. Brian Cobberger wasn't even sure exactly what he was doing. He was delivering somebody to the house. He was using GPS, which routed him around the house like Molly McMichaels and couldn't find the address and ended up parking at the back of the house, just like Molly McMichaels said happened when she was trying to deliver DoorDash to the house, and it took her all around and parked her at the back of the house. That's the same thing that happened to Brian Cobberger, which also, again, means Brian Cobberger was there in this hypothesis. So when you say, oh, look, his car was there, his phone was pinging off the cell tower that services the house. Yes, all of that could be true. And all of it could mean Brian Cobberger never went into the house. It doesn't mean he's squeaky clean, innocent as a lamb and all that shit if he delivered somebody to the house to do the killings. But the question is, do we know for sure he did the killings at all? Did he know there was killings going on? Did he even know? Or did he simply deliver somebody? Hey, dude, do you mind taking me over to this house? I got to go pick up some drugs. I got to go pick up something. Somebody stole something of mine. I'm going to go in and get it. Just hang out and wait for me. I'll be right back. What if that happened to Brian Cobberger? Are you okay with him going down in history as the greatest monster that ever lived for slaughtering a bunch of people because he's an incel and couldn't get laid? Or is it possible that that's not how it happened, but he was forced to comply because they got DNA evidence that they essentially planted by saying, look, we can't place Cobberger in the house. Dylan Mortenson's not giving us a perfect identity. We can't stick Cobberger in the house. Even Dylan Morton said, I think the killer knew me. Did she know Brent Kopacka? Did she know whoever the killer was? We don't know. The point being, even she said that. And the cops tried to lead Dylan to a better description of Brian Cobberger, but they couldn't. Then they came forward with Othram Labs. Othram Labs couldn't develop it to Brian Cobberger. They developed it to 4 brothers in Pennsylvania, none of which had the last name Cobberger. None of which. And they will tell you that from there, we somehow got to Brian Cobberger, but they don't want to show you the math. They don't want to show you how it happened. Othram developed it to 4 brothers in Pennsylvania, none of which were Cobbergers. Somehow they worked up that family tree sideways and back down to Cobberger because they knew Cobberger was at the scene. That's the logic in this hypothesis. They already knew Cobberger was there. They knew he had driven the car, but they couldn't place him in the house. Partly because he may have never fucking gone into the house. Listen, he may have never even gone into the house. And again, some of you think, who cares? If you deliver a killer there, yes, you're right. Let me get this clear. I want to say this for those of you who are going to bust my nuts. Yes, many states have a rule. If you drive somebody somewhere to a crime and they commit murder, you're guilty of murder as well. Accomplice to murder is the same thing as murder. But, and while I agree with you, if he's in jail for accomplice to murder, that's one thing. But he wasn't in jail for accomplice to murder, was he? He's in jail because he said, did you go into the house and you kill all 4 of these people and you did it alone because you did do it alone and you did it? Yeah, he said all those things. And I don't think that's how it happened. I think that's horseshit. So do you want to know the real story? Do you want to know what really happened? Or do you want to accept the easy answer because accomplice to murder is the same thing to murder? And ultimately, it doesn't really matter whether or not Brian Cobberger went into the house and actually did the stabbings. We can still call him a monster. And then we can put movies on TV about slasher films about how Cobberger did it and show everybody in America how Cobberger went in and killed all these girls when he may have never fucking left his car. He may have literally just been a driver. Now, further this story. So they can't find the knife after forever. They can't find the knife sheath. They end up calling maybe they're trying to get him there. And by the way, again, let's not forget the Molly McMichael thing. After forever of them saying to America, we've got DNA, Brian Cobberger's DNA is in the house. And most of you bought that. They also said simultaneously, and then a a big part of America wasn't listening. They never intended to use the DNA evidence in trial. They said they've got enough circumstantial evidence. They don't need to use the DNA evidence. They knew the DNA evidence was horseshit. By the way, there's evidence tampering. There's indication that the bags that held the evidence with the DNA were tampered with. There's evidence of that in the documents that just came out. The evidence bags were tampered with, as if somebody knew who they wanted to place at the scene, and they couldn't. Othram Labs couldn't place them at the scene. Dillon couldn't place them at the scene. Late in the game, a person who said, I'm friends with Bill Thompson, and now I have to go and testify saying I saw Bryan Kohberger at the house that night. That was a bullshit story. And America started to figure out it was a bullshit story, and they backed away from putting Molly in the house. Ultimately, listen, Molly McMichael had a run-in in a history with law enforcement, and she had a Bill Thompson as her prosecutor, or sorry, not as her defendant, in a case, a murder case involving her husband, who was killed by another individual. So Molly's, I think it was boyfriend or husband. Maybe he wasn't maybe he wasn't a husband, he was a boyfriend. Anyways, Molly's partner years and years ago was killed by another man trying to break into this person's residence and was killed. Bill Thompson represented Molly. She even said to an officer, oh yeah, I'm friends with Bill Thompson. So in comes Molly late in this game when they can't get Bryan Kohberger. They cannot get a definitive placement of Kohberger in the house. Even the DNA they know is not going to place Kohberger in the house because it's going to break down. If Ann Taylor is allowed to present the tampered evidence bags, the way it was handled, and even exposed, and I think Ann Taylor tipped her hat, and I think they knew where they were fucked. I'm telling you, Ann Taylor made Detective Payne on the stand say over and over again, we didn't know who Bryan Kohberger was until December 19th. I now see that what I think Ann Taylor saw as well. They knew about Bryan Kohberger on the 5th. And the reason why that's important is she's going to get them to perjure themselves. You say you didn't know who Bryan Kohberger was on the 19th. You didn't develop the DNA profile of Bryan Kohberger till well after the 5th, but you knew who Bryan Kohberger was on the 5th, which would lead some people on a jury to say, you knew who the guy was, but you couldn't place him in the house. And so you developed the DNA profile to the guy you needed to put in the house. And that's the argument she would have made. Hitler was never going to allow that to go out in court because it would basically, a jury might say, you know what, that looks a little sketchy. You're lying saying you didn't know about the guy until the 19th, until after the DNA return came back. But the reality is you knew him before the DNA return came back. Therefore, did you make the DNA fit the guy you knew was there at the crime scene? That's what she was going to argue. I am firmly convinced of it. Now, further on some of these things. The knife itself has never been found, right? And so Kopacka, and I've said this before, Kopacka had family, his mom owned a house down in Lewiston, Idaho. We are told after the crime, Kohberger, for some reason, went by the house earlier that morning and then drove down to Clarkston, Washington, where he went to a Costco, and possibly down through Lewiston, Idaho. That part is a little hard to prove, but I said early in the game, well, isn't it interesting that he went down to Lewiston, Clarkston? They were butted up against each other on the two sides of a river. And by the way, all through this case is a talk about Wawaway Park along the Snake River. The Snake River winds all the way down, a big windy river, big, huge windy river. What would be easy to dump, say, a knife, for example, or evidence, clothing, whatever the case may be. That river has got a million dumping places. Part of Bryan Kohberger's alibi was that he was at Wawaway Park that night doing stargazing, and people said, that's horseshit. You weren't out stargazing. You were over there in Moscow in the opposite direction, murdering 4 college students. Again, it is possible Bryan Kohberger took somebody to the crime scene and maybe even took somebody later on the path down to Clarkston, Washington that morning to dump the knife or dump the clothes. Even in that scenario, Bryan Kohberger may not be the killer. He may simply know who the killer is and helping get rid of evidence. He may have been driving them. And again, some of you say, who gives a shit? If he's an accomplice to murder, he's a murderer. But do you care to know exactly how it happened? In my hypothesis, it is possible Bryan Kohberger could have been taking evidence and or the person who committed the crimes back down to the Lewiston, Clarkston area, Clarkston, Washington, Lewiston, Idaho, where Kopacka has a house, where his family has a house. Now, here's the thing that's funny. Some of you have been busting my nuts lately, and I realize this is going a million miles an hour. Some of you have been busting my nuts lately about how Pavarotti, famous YouTuber on the Idaho 4 case, been doing a fantastic job, has already solved this case, right? And so I will tell you about the Kopacka thing. Kopacka may have done it. Kopacka may have done it. I think Kopacka had the skills. I think they knew each other from Pennsylvania. Early on, Pavarotti, who many people believe has solved this case 12 different times, Pavarotti mentioned Kopacka and all the connections with Kopacka. I just watched Pavarotti's recent video just today. And guess what Pavarotti said today? I hate to say it, but there's a strong possibility Brent Kopacka was involved with this. Brent Kopacka may have actually been one of the killers. Pavarotti said that today, November 7th, 2025. After all this time of you telling me he's got it all solved, he figured it out, it's Mowich, it's so-and-so, it's this, it's 12 different other people. And I'm not busting Pavarotti's nuts. I'm busting the nuts of some of Pavarotti's fans who go uber obsessed with everything and act like he didn't say early on Kopacka could have been involved. And just today, November 7th, 2025, Pavarotti in his latest video about Dylan said, I hate to say it, but Brent Kopacka may actually be involved in this thing. Brent Kopacka may have been one of the assailants. And I've been saying that same thing since day one. And again, to be fair, Pavarotti said it very early on as well. So it's not like I beat him to the point. This isn't a dick swinging contest. I'm just saying, for those of you who think Pavarotti has proved me wrong, it's not Kopacka, he just said today it could be Kopacka. And I think it makes a lot of sense. So the hypothesis has been laid out for you. The new hypothesis that I'm saying is, what if the delay and the 911 call is because the killer or killers realized they didn't have the knife sheath and they were in a panic? They got to find the knife sheath. And so time goes by, but maybe Dylan doesn't want to go disturb mutilated bodies. Maybe it does disturb her, despite the fact that she might have known what happened. Maybe she didn't go there. Maybe even possibly someone like Bryan Kohberger went back to the house looking for the knife sheath and they couldn't find it because maybe it was underneath the body. Now, here's the problem to finish out this whole hypothesis string thought process for the day. That knife sheath that we've now seen, finally, ISP forensics documents have come out, some 2,000 something pages, which includes pictures of the knife sheath. And I was stunned. I was stunned because I read court documents that said 4 different alternative suspects were ruled out as not matching blood found on the sheath. Stop for a moment and understand what I'm saying. Stop for a moment. Originally, we were told that the only part of DNA evidence on the knife sheath is a speck, the size less than the size of a grain of sand, that is definitive single source DNA tying Bryan Kohberger to the crime scene. I would argue that's likely horseshit. They knew who Bryan Kohberger was and they couldn't place him at the house. And they tried to place him through Dylan Mortensen, and she didn't give a good enough testimony. She wasn't reliable enough. Her fucking testimony was shit, and they knew it was shit, so they couldn't rely on Dylan Mortensen. So then they got DNA evidence, which they think they had to plant, and Ann Taylor was going to prove. You knew who Bryan Kohberger was before you came up with the DNA evidence. You placed Bryan Kohberger at the scene. They didn't place the knife sheath at the scene, in my opinion. They did not place the knife sheath at the scene. What they placed was the DNA evidence saying it was on the knife sheath. That's what I'm saying, is that Ann Taylor was going to argue that the DNA evidence was only planted, or was only said it was Bryan Kohberger because they knew it was Bryan Kohberger, and they needed to get some lab somewhere to say the single source DNA we found on it is Bryan Kohberger's. But they don't want to show you how they did it. Listen, the feds do not want to show you how they got Bryan Kohberger's DNA. All we know is Othram Labs didn't develop it to Bryan Kohberger. It did not come to Bryan Kohberger. It came to 4 brothers in Pennsylvania. And I said, it's Kopacka's family. It's in my best guess. My hypothesis is the 4 brothers is Brent Kopacka and his brothers, which are like Zach and Ethan and I don't know. There's a couple different names. Brent Kopacka had 3 other brothers. That makes 4 brothers, of which Darcy Nixon, who's Brent Kopacka's mother, she had multiple houses in Pennsylvania at the time that Kopacka was getting out of the military, at the time that the Kohbergers there, at the time that Bryan Kohberger's sister Amanda was starring in a horror film in Pennsylvania, and Kopacka and his friends are horror film fans. I've laid all of this out. I think they knew each other from Pennsylvania. I think they came out together, Cobberger and Kopacka, to Washington State. Whether they came out to commit this murder or not, I am not sure. That's not an official part of my hypothesis, but they came out to Washington State. I think they were on the eyes of the FBI. They were on the radar of the FBI. Maybe the FBI had tipped off that Cobberger and Kopacka, or just Kopacka or whatever, was coming out to Washington State to do a hit. Maybe they had a tip off on that early on. And maybe they were watching them early on. Many of you will tell me, oh yeah, the feds knew about Cobberger very early on. The problem with that is the MPD's lead detective, Payne, told us no one knew about Bryan Cobberger until the 19th of December. So you can all call me an asshole all you want and say, well, they knew about him long before that. Yeah, I agree with you. I 100% agree with you. They knew about him long before that. But on the record, on the court document, they didn't know about him until the 19th when the DNA hit came back to Bryan Cobberger. That's the part you're missing. I don't give a shit how long they knew about about him necessarily. What I'm saying is, what did they say on the record? We didn't know about him until the 19th. If Ann Taylor is right, and if we're all right, and if you're right that they knew about Cobberger long before the 19th, then it leads to the planted evidence thing. You knew who the guy was, but you couldn't place him in the house. So because you knew who he was, you made sure the evidence fit him. And when Othram Labs didn't do their job, when Idaho State Police couldn't do their job and develop the Cobberger, so the Idaho State Forensic Lab could not come up with Cobberger. They put it into CODIS, and there was no hit. They put it into CODIS, there was no hit. Brian Cobberger didn't come up. Then they turned it over to Othram Labs, who was contracted by Idaho State to do deeper testing. Othram Labs also could not bring it to Cobberger. They brought it to 4 brothers who they say came from Pennsylvania. I would say the Kopackas, whose family, his mother, had a house in Pennsylvania during the same time the Cobbergers were there. By the way, that same mother had a house in Lewiston, Idaho at the time of the murders. How fucking coincidental is that shit? Blow me off if you want. Call me an asshole. I'm just connecting dots and making a hypothesis. Prove me wrong. So listen. The Kopackas had homes back in Pennsylvania. Then they had homes in Lewiston when the murders happened. Cobberger takes a trip down to Lewiston, Idaho, possibly. I can't prove he went into Lewiston. I can prove he went to Clarkston, which is right across the river from Lewiston. It's extremely close. Pavarotti, just today, in his November 7th, video, just today, mentioned, again, the connections between Kopacka and Lewiston, Idaho. And he even said, Did you know that Kopacka's mom had a house in Lewiston, Idaho at the time of the murders? I said it. Kopacka said it. Kopacka. Pavarotti said it again today. Listen. These guys knew each other, in my opinion. Cobberger and Kopacka knew each other. Kopacka likely was one of the assailants in my hypothesis. Prove me wrong. And here's one of the ways you could prove me wrong, but will never happen. Test the blood on the knife sheath. Test the blood on the walls. There's blood. Test the blood of unknown male B, unknown male D in the bloody gloves. Test those blood against Kopacka. You never will. You still can. Fucking get a hairbrush of Kopacka. There's plenty of places you can get Kopacka's DNA to this day. Test it against the crime scene. You never will. And by the way, unfortunately, I'm blowing myself in the foot here, because even if they do test it, if they have Othram Labs test it, and if Othram Labs was involved, or if anybody was involved in planting evidence of Brian Cobberger, do you trust those people to tell you the truth anyways? But I would like to have it tested against Kopacka and exclude Kopacka. Where I'm going with the knife sheath, this full circle on this whole thing, is I was surprised when I found out in the documents that Ann Taylor presented 4 alternative suspects, which Hippler said would never be allowed to be in court. You have to have definitive proof those 4 alternative suspects are tied to the crime, or you can't bring up their name. Ann Taylor tried to do that. But here's the thing. They tested, and this was in the documents, they tested all 4 of Ann Taylor's alternative suspects against the blood in part on the back of the knife sheath. We didn't even know there was other blood on the back of the knife sheath. What other blood on the back of the knife sheath? So I'm imagining to myself that knife sheath must have a smear of blood on the back, of which they tested the 4 alternative suspects, and they were all excluded as possible contributors to the blood on the knife sheath. Now listen, you can go almost 100% certain that also excluded is Brian Cobberger, because if Brian Cobberger's DNA was not excluded from being on the blood on the knife sheath, we would have heard about it all day long. They would have said, not only is Brian Cobberger's single source DNA found on the strap of that knife sheath, but his blood cannot be excluded from the other blood on the knife sheath. They never said that, because Brian Cobberger was excluded from all the other blood on the knife sheath. That should tell you something. We know 4 people were ruled out because they were excluded as being contributors to the blood on the knife sheath. Brian Cobberger, by extension, also must have been excluded as a contributor to the blood on the knife sheath, or they would have told you about it as further support Brian Cobberger committed the murders. But they're still sticking with the only source of DNA from Brian Cobberger as a single source speck of DNA smaller than a grain of sand on the strap. They have never said, and also he can't be excluded from a contributor of other blood. Listen, pay attention. Brian Cobberger is excluded from being a contributor to any other blood. But here's the real kicker. When I saw the knife sheath, you can't see the blood. You can't see the blood of anybody on there. What you see is a circled spot that said, here was a spot of blood. Here was a fleck of blood. They're flecks of blood, which were supposedly tested against 4 different individuals to exclude them. Maybe 5 if they tested it against Brian Cobberger, because they would have had to have. It was a fleck that you practically cannot see with the naked eye. That knife sheath looks damn near pristine. And the further thing to add to this hypothesis is this. We know that Moscow Police Department purchased a knife, a K-bar knife and knife sheath from Amazon to replicate what they believe Brian Cobberger did, buying it online. They bought one for themselves and had it shipped, and it was in police evidence. One has to ask the question, is the knife sheath that we see in the photos with circles on it saying this is where blood was found, this is where blood was found, is that even the same knife sheath? Because if that knife sheath was under the body of Maddie Mogen, who had just been mutilated, why is it not soaked in blood? Why is it not soaked in blood? So we've got a million questions, but I just want to wrap up one more time. Here's the hypothesis. The hypothesis is Brent Kopacka was involved in the killings. Brent Kopacka was shot and killed by police later as a mistake. They shouldn't have done it. They believe, and they always believed, that Cobberger was involved either as a driver or he knew Kopacka from back the time they were in Pennsylvania. They made that connection, just like I made this connection, just like Pavarotti made the connection. He also made the connection that the Cobbergers probably knew the Kopackas from back in Pennsylvania. He said that. I said that. Crime Circus said that. A whole bunch of them have been saying that. And yet to this day, we're all shamed every single time we talk about Brent Kopacka. And I apologize to Kopacka's family if he had nothing to do with it. It's a hypothesis. Again, don't fucking take things personally. It's a hypothesis. Prove me wrong. Just prove it wrong. It's not personal. It's a hypothesis. The scientific community doesn't get pissed off when you make a hypothesis that fucking the sun revolves around the earth, or the earth revolves around the sun. They make a hypothesis and they test it. Prove me wrong. It's nothing personal. Here's the hypothesis. Does the sun revolve around the moon or the earth, or does the earth revolve around the sun? Like, it's a hypothesis. You test it. You get scientific data and you try to prove it wrong. It's not personal. All right. So at the end of the day, I have to ask myself new questions. Is the delay in the 911 call because people were panicked because they couldn't find the knife sheath? The knife sheath was underneath Maddie Mogen. The problem with that whole scenario is, why isn't it soaked in blood? Food for thought. Prove me wrong. I'm just curious what you think about my new ideas that I'm kind of linking all together. As I walk through this, I'm kind of like just doing a stream of consciousness. What do you think about the new hypothesis? Let me know. Bye.